Another thing that we don't have time to dive deep into, but I wanted to show you to kind of expose you to what's possible, is the ability for us to put things in a web worker. So JavaScript is single threaded. That means that all of this stuff that's happening all up and down this flame graph, this is all happening one thing at a time. It can't happen all at the same time. Because of that, if this takes longer than the 16 milliseconds, then the browser actually just locks up and it can't update the screen, which results in that janky experience. But what if we could take the JavaScript code that we need to run and set it off somewhere else to do all of its hard logic, difficult stuff, and then when it's all done, then it can send that result back to the browser. So the main thread of the browser doesn't have to do all of that hard and difficult stuff, but it can actually offload that to some other process on the computer so we don't get that jank in the browser. So I've already got this set up. We have this filter cities, but we also have a workerized filter cities, and you can take a look at that right there. This is the workerized filter cities. This is using a Webpack loader called Workerize, but there are many different ways that you could do web workers. This is just one of them, and it's simply taking that same filter cities module that we had before and putting it into a web worker. And this gives us back a factory function that we can use to create a web worker for this module. And this will give us all the exports for that module. So that's the get items function. And now we'll just export that get items function. Now, the communication between a web worker and the browser main thread is going to be asynchronous just by the very nature of the way those APIs work. And so now get items is going to be asynchronous. And so we're going to need to change just a couple of things around. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to replace this import of get items to import that from workerized filtered cities. And now our get items is asynchronous. And so I'm going to pull another utility that might be familiar to you, that is use async. This is going to come from our utils. You can dive into that to look at how that works, or you might just remember how that works from previous workshops. And then we'll scroll on down here to where we're using this use memo to call get items. And now it is async. So what we're going to have to do is we'll call use async, and this is going to return to us a run function. And then in a use effect, that's where we do our side effects and our asynchronous stuff. We're going to call that run function with our now asynchronous get items function. So I'm going to just grab that right here. And then we'll add our dependency array here. We'll just let that autofill from our ESLint plugin. And then we don't need to worry about this use memo anymore. We can just ditch that. And we're now going to get our all items from the data. So I'll just alias that to all items. And so now when our app mounts, it's going to go ahead and run this get items asynchronous function. When that function resolves, it's going to trigger a re-render thanks to use async, which will give us the data for all of the items. And now we're also going to initialize this use async to have data that it starts out as an empty array. And we'll go ahead and start the status out as pending, because we know that's what's going to happen immediately. So we'll just get it started as pending. So let's go ahead and save that, and we'll get a refresh here. Again, we're still on a 6x slowdown, but now if I choose Edna, and then we'll click this. Remember, this was 52 milliseconds. Now I'll hit record. We'll come over to force a re-render. Then we'll stop recording. And let's see, we've got it down to 38. Okay, so it's a little bit improved here, but there's definitely some additional things that we can do to speed this thing up. In review, what we did here was pretty simple. We took this workerized filtered cities that I had in place already, and we have this Workerize Webpack loader. You don't really need to worry about this too much. Mostly what I want you to learn about this is that you can take some JavaScript that's expensive to run and put it on a separate thread so your main thread is freed up to display things to the user more rapidly. But in our case, we're using this Workerize loader for Webpack to get our filter cities module into a web worker. And then we get this asynchronous version of this get items function. And then we take that with our use async hook. And down here, we initialize our use async hook with the data and a status. And then right here, we say React use effect as a side effect to trigger this asynchronous operation. We're going to get the items with the input value, and we are only getting the items when that input value changes. We're including our run function here, but use async is ensuring that this run function is stable. So we really will only be calling getItems when that input value changes. And because it's happening on a separate thread, it's going to run a little bit faster as well. And when it resolves with all of the data that we want, use async will trigger a re-render, and now all items is going to include all of the cities that come back as a result of this operation. Now, I wouldn't recommend that you always use web workers in every situation. It doesn't necessarily make sense all the time, but it's absolutely something worth trying if you have some really intense calculations that the browser needs to crunch through and you want to free the main thread to be able to do some work while you're doing that intense calculation.